morning. So as mentioned before, I joined the ESET 10 years ago, and actually I joined as a very, very, very junior malware researcher. Basically, I knew nothing about the job. I barely knew what the company was doing, except that it's an antivirus company, and honestly, I could hardly point Slovakia on a world map. A bit ashamed of that, but anyway, and in 10 years, lots of things have changed. I traveled over 30 times to Slovakia, so now I can pretty much identify where it is in Europe. I know much more about the company, and I know a little more about the malware research job. And in fact, I lead ESET's R&D center in Montreal, where we are about a dozen malware researchers, basically hunting for new malware and doing in-depth analysis. And we use what we find to improve our product, keep our customers safer online, but we also share our findings with the community, with the world. We publish lots of blog posts, white papers, and we are present at lots of technical conferences to inform people of our findings. And another part of the job is to raise awareness about recent cybersecurity issues and give advice to help everyone, the general public, to stay safer online. And this is one part of the job that I really like, and I get to share some case studies of real attacks that worked, and try to draw some conclusions or ways to prevent these attacks from being successful in the future. And I will often come back to the same set of advice. So what do you think I tell people to do or not to do online to be safe? What do you hear all the time? Keep your software up to date. Of course, don't reuse passwords. Use password managers. Enable two-factor authentication whenever it's possible. Run a reputable endpoint security solution, for example. But there's one advice that I hear from time to time that I actually no longer give. I no longer tell people to avoid visiting suspicious websites if they want to stay safe online. It might seem controversial or not, but anyway, hear me out. So first, I believe it's extremely difficult for anyone to accurately determine the suspiciousness of a given website. I think from what I've seen by experience is that technology is way more appropriate to protect users from accessing these websites in the first place. If you think about it, technology can, for example, know if a given website was seen serving malware in the past, or determine that the website, a particular domain name was registered just a few days ago and already serving executable files that have never been seen before. So basically, technology can trigger on a bunch of hints or properties and eventually block the user from accessing the website itself. And the attackers, they know this. They know that technology looks for certain markers of badness, and they adapt. They try to bypass all these checks. And so imagine if attackers had a way to distribute malware, but from a reputable website that's been seen for many years, that belongs to a legitimate software company. The website might even be whitelisted in some protection engines. What if they could distribute malware signed by valid digital code signing certificates, or even insert malicious code straight in software update mechanisms, such as Windows Update, for example. So it might seem like an impossible dream, but actually that's exactly what attackers are doing right now when they succeed in performing a supply chain attack. And so this is the plan for the rest of the presentation. The introduction is pretty much done. I only want to explain in a little more detail what a software supply chain attack is. Then I'll talk about a few case studies that we've seen in the past, and in conclusion, I'll share a few potential solutions to counter these types of attacks and a few philosophical thoughts. So before talking about an attack against the supply chain, let's see what the typical software supply chain looks like. So first, software exists under the form of source code. And once it's ready to be released, the source code goes through the build system. That's where the compiler and linker will convert the source code into executable files. There might be some final quality assurance checks, and if everything checks out, the code is digitally signed and bundled into one installer file. And the result must be distributed, and more often than not, it's through a website. Now, a successful attack on this supply chain needs to compromise one of those steps. At the source code level, an attacker could manage to insert malicious code straight into the software source code that will eventually get built and distributed. That can be done, for example, by the attacker stealing some developer credentials and pushing a commit as if the attacker was the actual developer. The attack can also happen on the build system itself, where the attackers can steal code signing certificates, for example, or insert a malicious component in the whole chain that will be included in the final output. And the attackers can also target the distribution system. Basically, imagine an attacker hacking into the web server that hosts the final installer and replace the installer with the Trojanized one. And so hacking into the software supply chain, the software supplier is one of the victims, but the end goal is not to compromise the vendor, but the vendor's customers that will eventually just visit a very non-suspicious website to download what they think is a legitimate software, but will be in fact infected. Now, in the last couple of years, we saw a huge increase in supply chain attack incidents. Several cases were made the headlines. They were noteworthy because of the scale of the attacks. One of those was the attack on the makers of CCleaner, which is kind of ironically a software that's supposed to clean your computer from useless files and registry keys. That attack itself led to the infection of 2 million computers. Then there was the NotPetya ransomware. So who heard about NotPetya, the NotPetya attack? And keep your hands up. Who knew that what enabled the NotPetya attack was actually a supply chain attack? Cool. If I have time at the end, I'll come back to that case specifically. I'm going to focus on 2 other supply chain attacks that happened in the last couple of years to illustrate how the attacks went down. And I'll focus on these cases because, well, the time is limited, and actually those 2 attacks were discovered and exposed by researchers in Montreal. So the first case is about Transmission. Transmission is an open source BitTorrent client for the Mac platform. It's one of the popular clients. It's not the most popular, but it's used by a fairly large number of people. And so first, some Palo Alto researchers discovered an infected version of the Transmission software being distributed on the Transmission website. It was infected with a brand new Mac malware called KE Ranger, which actually was the very first ransomware for the Mac platform. And the malware was signed with a valid digital code signing certificate, which allowed the malware to execute despite Apple's gatekeeper security mechanism, which is made to prevent the execution of unsigned executables. About 6 months later, it was actually our turn to find something very similar. So in our case, the Transmission installer was infected with a different malware. It was a malware called Kidnap. And we actually discovered Kidnap a month before we knew about this second Transmission incident. And Kidnap is a malware. At the time, it was a new malware family, and it did 2 things. First, it allowed the attacker to keep control over the infected system. And the other feature was to steal the keychain, which is a built-in password manager in macOS. And so when we analyzed Kidnap, we didn't know about the infection vector. We didn't know how people got in contact with the malware. And one of the hypotheses was that we supposed that the victims downloaded the malware from untrusted or suspicious websites. But when we discovered the transmission case, we realized it's actually the very opposite. Users were actually visiting a very trusted website, the transmission website, and got the malware from there. And so the context behind transmission, as I mentioned, it's an open source software. It's all the development and the maintenance of the software and the infrastructure is done by volunteers. They're not getting paid for their work. And what happened is that attackers gained root access to the Linux web server that was hosting the whole transmission website, including the download sections. So the attacker uploaded a Trojanized version of transmission that was bundled with Kidnap and edited the HTML code in the download page to point to the malicious version, and that was it. So basically, the attackers compromised the distribution part of the supply chain of the transmission team. So even the most careful user, making sure that the transmission website was the valid one, it was not shady, it was around for many years, it's a reputable software. Even if the user checked if the executable was signed by a valid Apple certificate, would have fell for this infection. Now let's move on to something a bit different. I want to talk to you about a simple and clever hosting control panel called Vesta CP. Again, it's an open source product. It's available on GitHub, and it's a product that's very similar to cPanel. So basically, it allows web hosting companies to manage their customers' websites and other hosting services, such as mail accounts or database instances. And the people in my team in Montreal actually stumbled upon Vesta CP by accident because they were looking at something else. They were analyzing a new Linux malware called ChachaBot, whose main functionality was to launch denial of service attacks. And so while researching ChachaBot, we found users complaining about their server consuming a lot of bandwidth, and they were trying to understand what was going on and suspecting they were compromised, but they were trying to find out what was going on. And these complaints, most of these complaints were found on the Vesta CP community forum. And so we matched the behavior of ChachaBot with these complaints, and we looked into Vesta CP. And what we discovered will shock you. So first we looked at how to install Vesta CP on a new server. And these are the official instructions from Vesta CP. So first you connect into the server on which you want to deploy Vesta CP. Then you download a bash script from that website, from the Vesta CP website, and you run it as root. Very simple and clever, as long as this script doesn't contain anything malicious. And so we looked at the installation script, and it was on GitHub, of course, and we saw one tiny change, only one line, one suspicious commit that changed everything. And so the content of the variable code name here, what you see, was enhanced to include the Vesta CP admin password that was just set by the admin that is currently installing the Vesta CP software, along with the server's address, all put into base 64. And that's it. That's the only line that changed. Now, by itself, this change is kind of benign, right? But in our case, the clean script actually contains a line that pushes the content of the variable to the vestacp.com server. Usually the variable contains the Linux distribution and version on which the Vesta CP is being installed. So it's some sort of telemetry from built in by the Vesta CP developers. Basically, they want to know on which type of machines their software is being deployed. Totally legit. But now this telemetry contains a password. And so could it be that the developers behind Vesta CP turned bad? Actually, no. They were victim of a supply chain attack. And so the attackers compromised the source code itself, which eventually was pushed into production. And not only that, but attackers also gain root access to the web server, and that's how they were able to collect the stolen information that was stored on the web server's log files. And using that combination of server address and Vista CP admin password, that's how they were able to distribute the ChaChaBot DOS malware and launch attacks that consume a lot of bandwidth on the victims who were the Vista CP customers. And so a few words to conclude. Back to what I said earlier, I still believe users cannot reliably determine if a website is suspicious or not. Technology is better at it, even if it's not 100% perfect. And even if we were able to accurately all the time determine if a website is suspicious, attackers are moving more and more towards supply chain attacks. One of the advantages for the attackers is that one successful attack will yield remote code execution on a lot of end users. Now, what can we do about it? I believe the problem cannot be solved at the end user level, so others need to step in. For security vendors like ESET and all the other researchers out there, we need to keep on researching first to expose or to find out about these ongoing attacks, and to find ways to remediate or to detect automatically that the supply chain attack is occurring. Software vendors also have a responsibility in that they first need to realize that they are a target of these types of attacks, and they need to properly secure their supply chain. And what about accountability? When a software vendor gets compromised that way and their customers receive malicious code, could or should we hold these vendors accountable? I mean, for a large software vendor, it kind of makes sense. They have money. We could think about a lawsuit or a class action suit. But what about all these smaller players, small software shops that might be operating in faraway countries? Or what about these open source projects where there's no money involved? So even if you get infected and you sue the Vista CP developers, what are you going to end up with? And yesterday we had some good discussions about cyber insurance. Could it be part of the solution where vendor could get cyber insurance to protect, not to protect, but to insure them against the damages that could have been done to their customers following a supply chain attack? Maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure, but it should certainly be subject for more discussion by the insurers out there who are building the next insurance coverage plans. Thank you.